My name is Mike, and I'm a junior at the Southern Illinois University. My major was in archaeology, but I can't remember having much passion. It sounded like a cool thing, but had become a redundancy of lectures and dates I was starting to drone out. So I agreed to intern as a research assistant up near Ottawa. Huge mistake. Forgot how much I hated camping. It didn't take long for all that to change. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves as I climbed the last stretch of the trail toward the dig site. Starved Rock loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette bathed in the gold and crimson glow of late afternoon. I pressed forward, my boots sinking into the dirt, my pulse quickening with something that felt like reverence. I'd studied this place in textbooks, seen the plaques lining the trails, but standing here, touching the stone, breathing the air, it all felt different, more real, more alive. Professor Buchanan met me at the ridge, his weathered face unreadable as he gestured toward the excavation. "Welcome to the past," he said. We dug for weeks, unearthing fragments of pottery, tools, arrowheads, traces of lives reduced to museum exhibits and footnotes in history books. The others marveled at each discovery, but I felt something heavier beneath the thrill. A presence. The kind that pressed against the edges of perception, whispering just beyond understanding. Then came the charm. I found it buried near the rock's edge, nestled among shards of broken clay. No bigger than a river stone, it was carved from dark, polished wood, its surface smooth except for the delicate etchings along its face. Spirals, waves, a symbol I didn't recognize. When I lifted it, warmth bloomed against my palm, like skin meeting skin. "Anything interesting?" Professor Buchanan asked, stepping beside me. I hesitated. I could have said no, could have called it a simple trinket, but the truth clawed at my throat. I think this meant something to someone. The professor studied it with quiet curiosity before handing it back. "Everything we find once belonged to someone," he said. "The question is whether history bothered to remember them." That night, the fire flickered low as I sat near the embers, the charm resting in my hands. The others long since retreated to their tents, their voices now distant murmurs swallowed by the trees. Above, the sky stretched wide and endless, constellations pulsing against the black. I traced the carvings with my thumb, the patterns hypnotic, each groove deep enough to suggest years of wear. A lover's token, a warrior's keepsake. Whoever it belonged to carried it often, fingers pressing into the same places mine did now. A strange comfort settled over me. The wind stirred, cooler than before, and the fire shuddered in its grasp. Shadows stretched long across the ground, shifting, curling at the edges like something alive. A hush settled over the woods. Not silence, but absence. No rustling branches, no insects, no distant calls of nightbirds. The charm pulsed against my skin. A weightless sensation took hold, like stepping off solid ground, like teetering at the edge of a great unseen drop. My breath hitched. The world wavered, heat and shadow twisting in impossible patterns, the sky folding into itself. The fire collapsed into darkness. The air thickened, charged with something ancient, something vast. I reached out, but my hands met nothing. The earth vanished beneath me. And then, I was falling. The world settled before my senses could catch up. The rush of falling, the weightless terror, gone. Instead, hard earth pressed against my hands, rough and cold. Smoke curled in the air, thick with the scent of burning wood and something heavier. Voices rose in the distance, sharp with urgency. Not English. A language older than the land beneath me. I pushed myself upright, my limbs trembling, my breath hitching in the back of my throat. Firelight flickered in scattered pits, casting jagged shadows across lean figures hunched in the dim glow. Shapes moved between the flames. People. Dozens of them. Hollow-cheeked, their eyes dark pools reflecting the fire's glow. The desperation in their movements struck first. Then the hunger. They noticed me all at once. A ripple of recognition, or maybe alarm, passed through them like wind cutting through brittle leaves. I stiffened as their gazes locked onto mine, some wide with shock, Others narrowed with something harder, suspicion. Then came the voices. Low murmurs swelled into something louder. Sharp words clashed between them, indecipherable yet edged with accusation. A woman pointed at my jacket, her fingers curling like claws. A man, his ribs stark beneath his skin, took a step forward, knuckles bone white around the shaft of a spear. I lifted my hands, an instinct more than anything, but the movement only stirred more whispers. Their fear thickened, coiling tight around the space between us. They didn't understand me, and I couldn't blame them. I didn't belong here. Before anyone could decide if I was a threat, the crowd parted. He stepped forward then, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade drawn clean through cloth. Toluca. His name wasn't mine to know yet, but I felt it. The way his voice settled over the air, calm but firm. The way the others hesitated, listening. He was younger than most of the men, but his posture held weight, the kind earned rather than given. His gaze met mine, steady, assessing. Where the others flinched at the unfamiliar, the fabric of my clothes, the strangeness of my face, his expression remained unreadable. A question passed between us, unspoken. Who are you? The others barked more words, gesturing, accusing. A boy too small for his hunger clutched at his mother's leg, his wide eyes darting between me and Toluca. I didn't need translation to understand the risk I carried. A stranger arriving when food was gone, when the children's ribs showed like ridges beneath their skin. What good omen could that be? Toluca didn't flinch. He lifted a hand, silencing them with a look. Then he spoke. Not to me, to them. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face as he gestured toward me, his voice calm but firm. A debate, a challenge. I recognized it in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers curled in emphasis. Others protested, but he stood firm. They listened. One by one, they stepped back, their glares dulling to reluctant acceptance. The spear lowered, but not entirely. Toluca exhaled, barely audible, before turning toward me fully. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. He studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes catching every nervous twitch, every failed attempt to appear composed. Then he lifted his chin and spoke again. A single word clipped, but not unkind. I didn't understand it, but I understood him. He wasn't afraid. Not of me. Not yet. But I saw the way the others moved, the weight of their hunger pulling at their limbs, the exhaustion lining their faces. It didn't take an archaeologist to recognize the truth. If nothing changed, if time continued undisturbed, this place, these people, Toluca, would fade into the pages of legend. They would die, unless I stopped it. It was then I noticed he gestured toward my test while touching his own. He recognized his amulet, even if it hung from my neck after hundreds of years of erosion. He wore the exact same one, except his was new. The scariest part, I knew we were surrounded, under siege. And they knew what happened when one could no longer stand the hunger and attempted escape. Days blurred into nights, time losing shape as I sank deeper into their world. The sun carved patterns across the rock, rising and falling as the camp endured. Hunger tightened its grip, thinning their movements, sharpening their desperation. Each morning the fires burned lower. Each night, the air hummed with the quiet, unspoken truth. This place would kill them. And yet, they stayed. Toluca watched me with the same careful intensity he gave to the horizon, as if he expected me to disappear as suddenly as I arrived. He spoke to me in slow, measured words he learned from trading with the French and English. He was patient when I stumbled over my own understanding. We communicated in pieces, small fragments that never quite fit together. Yet Toluca never lost patience. He wanted to understand me as much as I wanted to understand him. "Where are you from?" he asked one evening, crouched beside me near the fire. The others rested in silence, exhausted from another day of the siege. His voice was low, meant for me alone. I hesitated, rolling a charred stick between my fingers. "Far from here." His smirk was slow, almost teasing. "You are faux liar." He wasn't wrong. I shifted, searching for something close to the truth. "I come from the future," I said, testing the words. He wouldn't understand them, not really, but it was the only answer I had. He considered me for a long moment before nodding, as if that was enough. And maybe, for him, it was. I learned their struggle in pieces, the war raging below, the enemies waiting like wolves circling wounded prey. The food stores dwindled past caution and into ruin. The elders believed in waiting, in surviving on hope and memory. They spoke of spirits, of signs, of fate. Toluca didn't share their certainty. I caught the way his fingers curled when they spoke of honor, the flicker of doubt behind his dark eyes. He was a warrior, bound by duty, but not blind to the truth. The rock was a grave waiting to be filled. If they stayed, they would die. But leaving meant risking everything. He told me once, his voice quiet beneath the weight of the moon, "It is better to fight than to run." "But what if you don't have to fight?" I asked. "What if you can leave?" His jaw tightened. "Then we run forever." I didn't have an answer for that. What I did have, what I wouldn't let myself name, was something I feared more than this unraveling history. I was falling for him. It happened in stolen glances, in the way his lips curled when he smirked, in the way his voice softened when he spoke to the children. In the nights spent beneath an unfamiliar sky, his presence steady beside me, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I told myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be. But love doesn't ask permission. He lingered when we were alone, his fingers brushing my wrist as he passed, his gaze holding mine a breath longer than necessary. If he noticed the way my hands trembled when he touched me, he didn't say. If he knew the way my pulse betrayed me, he didn't look away. And maybe that was worse. Because we both knew the truth. We were standing on the edge of something we couldn't hold on to. I tried to warn them in the only way I could, begging Toluca to convince the others to leave before it was too late. But fear wove through them, thick as the smoke curling from their dying fires. The elders held firm. To stay was to honor their dead. To leave was to become them. Toluca listened, his expression unreadable, his fingers gripping the charm still looped around his neck. "Time is running out," I whispered. His hand lingered at my shoulder, his thumb pressing lightly into my skin. He exhaled, slow and measured. "I know," he said. And still, he didn't let go. The days thinned, stretched tight like sinew pulled to its breaking point. The fires burned lower, flickering against hollowed faces, against bodies carved down to their last reserves. The air reeked of hunger, of waiting, of something worse. Resignation. And still they wouldn't leave. I tried everything. I begged. I reasoned. I swore up and down that if they stayed, they would die here. My words met walls of silence, of quiet stubbornness born of grief and tradition. They clung to the rock, as if the ghosts of their dead shackled them here. To leave would be to betray them. Toluca listened, always listening. But his expression remained unreadable, the weight of leadership pressing into his shoulders, into the firm set of his jaw. The elders commanded respect, and even he, proud and strong, bowed under the force of history. "You don't understand," he told me one night, as we stood away from the others, the distant glow of fire painting his skin in liquid gold. "Leaving means losing everything." "Staying means dying," I countered, my voice sharp with desperation. His gaze flickered over me, searching, but for what, I didn't know. "You fear for us," he said, a statement, not a question. I swallowed, my throat thick. "I fear for you." The wind stirred, cool against my overheated skin. He lifted a hand as if to reach for me, then let it fall. The space between us felt impossibly vast. "You were meant to be here," he murmured, as if speaking it aloud would make it true. "The spirits sent you." I shook my head. "No, Toluca, I don't belong here." The words felt like a knife turning inside me. He knew it as well as I did. Time was a cruel thing, a tide that would pull me away whether I fought it or not. He was of this world, of this moment. I was only borrowing it. And still, I ached for him. That night, when the stars burned bright and the fires smoldered into embers, I let my longing crack open. Toluca stood by the edge of the rock, watching the world below, the waiting tribes, the river carving its path through the land like an old scar. I stepped beside him, the space between us nothing more than breath. "If I leave," I said, voice barely above a whisper, "you have to leave too." His eyes met mine, dark and endless. "I can't." The truth settled between us, heavy and unmovable. My pulse roared in my ears, my hands trembling with something I didn't know how to name. So, I kissed him. Not gently, not sweetly. It was a collision of desperation, of fear, of everything I had no words for. He inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. His hands gripped my waist, anchoring me, his lips pressing back with the same fierce urgency, as if he was trying to commit me to memory. Every shape, every shiver, every unspoken thing between us. The moment stretched, fragile and fleeting. Then he broke away, his forehead pressing against mine, breath ragged. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Morning stole the night too soon. I woke to the sound of voices rising in alarm, bodies shifting with urgency. I stumbled to my feet, the weight of last night still pressed against my skin. Toluca was already moving, his expression dark. I followed his gaze. Below, warriors gathered at the base of the rock, their numbers thick, their weapons catching the morning light. This was it. Either they left now, or they died. The warriors below moved like a dark tide, their bodies shifting in the early morning light. Even from this height, I saw their weapons glint, heard the distant clatter of preparation. They were coming. They would climb. They would not leave until every last soul on this rock was silenced. I turned to Toluca, my chest tight, my breath coming too fast. "You have to make them leave," I said, my voice raw. "If you don't, they'll die here. You'll die here. And now's your chance." They're all gathered on one side. The weight of it pressed between us. His people stood behind him, their faces etched with hunger and fear, but also something harder: pride, resolve. They lived with this certainty for too long, believing that to run was to dishonor themselves. Toluca's gaze flickered across them, then back to me. "You speak as if you know the future," he said. Not an accusation, not a question, just the truth hanging between us. I swallowed, my throat thick. I placed a hand over the older version of his amulet that I wore, then my other hand over his. "I do." Something in him cracked then. I saw it in the way his shoulders shifted, in the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He turned away from me, stepping toward the elders, toward the warriors who still had strength left to fight. He spoke, his voice calm but firm, his words quick and deliberate. They argued. They clung to the rock with their voices, with their beliefs, unwilling to see another way. Then he looked back at me. Just once. Though they had elders who were very wise and warriors who redefined bravery, he was the oldest child of their lost chief, and he finally made the call. A single command, short, absolute. The finality of it settled over the group like a shroud. Some hesitated, their grief spilling into the dirt beneath them, but they moved. I saw mothers pull children to their chests, saw warriors hoist the frail onto their backs. The strongest led the way down the narrow, winding path that would take them from the rock, from the starvation. They left behind the few who were already dead. They left behind their history, carved into the very bones of this place. But they lived. Toluca was the last to turn away. He stood still for a breath, watching the place he called home, the place he prepared to die at. His fingers brushed the small charm around his neck, the same one I would find centuries later, buried beneath the dirt, the same one I wore now. Then he faced me. The words were there, thick in the space between us, but we were out of time. My vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting, the very fabric of time folding in on itself. My body seized, weightless and powerless all at once, and I knew what was happening. The universe played its game, and now it was pulling me back. I reached for him. Toluca moved toward me, instinct driving him forward, his hands grasping for something he couldn't hold. I saw his face last. Strong, resolute, but aching with all the things we would never say. Then he was gone to me, and I to him. I gasped, my lungs pulling in air too fast, too sharp. The world spun, and my body ached as if I were wrenched through time itself, which, I supposed, I was. The scent of wood smoke filled my nose. The crackle of the fire sounded close, grounding, real. Voices. My name. Mike? Professor Buchanan's voice rang through the night, thick with concern. I turned, and there he was, his weathered face creased in confusion. The other interns peered at me from their tents, the glow of the fire flickering in their wide eyes. I looked down. My hands trembled, my fingers curled around the old charm which hung around my neck. The weight of it nearly crushed me. I stumbled to my feet, the world too quiet, too still. My heart pounded, urging me forward. The plaques. I needed to see them. I ran, feet unsteady on the dirt, ignoring Buchanan's calls. My breath came in ragged bursts as I reached the edge of the overlook, where the informational signs stood, untouched, unmoving. I scanned the words, searching, desperate. My pulse roared in my ears. And then I read the best news I heard in a long time. There is no evidence that the Illiniwek ever starved on starved rock. Historians consider it only a legend. I exhaled sharply, the sound breaking apart in my throat. I reread the words, over and over, as if they might shift beneath my gaze, as if they might betray some hint of the truth only I knew. No evidence, no starvation, no bones buried beneath the earth. I let out something between a laugh and a sob, my fingers tightening around the charm. I changed history. They survived. He survived. I pressed the charm to my lips, my eyes burning. The night stretched wide around me, the sky endless and black, pinpricked with stars. Somewhere, in another time, Toluca was standing beneath these same constellations. Maybe he was wondering about me. Maybe he was holding on to something, a memory, a whisper of a dream. I threaded a stronger leather cord through the charm, tying it securely before slipping it back around my neck. It rested against my chest, heavy with meaning. A piece of the past, a gift to the future. A reminder that he lived. A reminder that I should live too.